The sky wasn't big enough for it. At 70,000 feet, the world above had already turned the black violet of space, and it was riding the very edge between Earth and the void, at a speed no Soviet fighter could ever match. Not because they were slow, because it was simply too fast. This is the XB-70 Valkyrie, the fastest bomber ever built. By 1957, the airspace America once considered untouchable was beginning to close in. Soviet fighters were climbing higher, radar was reaching further, and a new generation of surface-to-air missiles was emerging. The B-52 could still carry an entire intercontinental arsenal, but it flew slow, and a slow target at the right altitude is a target that dies. The Air Force understood this, so they wrote a requirement that sounded impossible. Mach 3 sustained, 70,000 feet, a range of thousands of miles. Not a quick dash and back, but that speed held for the entire mission. Higher than any fighter, faster than any bomber, and still able to deliver a nuclear payload anywhere on Earth. Two companies were invited to compete. Boeing, the maker of the B-52, the B-17, the B-29, the company that had built the backbone of American air power across 2 world wars. No one doubted they would win. And North American Aviation, a name most generals treated as the underdog. North American knew they couldn't win by playing the same hand. They dug through every piece of research they could find, and in an overlooked corner, they found something no one had noticed. A forgotten 1956 NACA report describing how to turn the supersonic shock wave, the thing every aircraft creates and treats as an enemy, into a source of free lift. No one had ever done it. North American decided to build the entire aircraft around it. In December 1957, Boeing lost. The team no one had bet on had just won the contract to build the most ambitious aircraft America had ever attempted. And they were only getting started. The first Valkyrie rolled out of the plant in Palmdale in 1964. 185 feet long, painted white, its nose stretching far forward before breaking into a single cockpit. Its fuselage alone was nearly as long as the entire wingspan of a B-52. It didn't look like something designed to fly. It looked like something that should have stayed on the ground. Fully fueled, it weighed 500,000 pounds. Its 6 General Electric engines pushed out roughly 180,000 pounds of thrust combined. And that mass of metal flew at Mach 3. Not a burst, then a slowdown, but the whole way. From California to Moscow, if the day ever came. Remember, this was the 1960s. No modern CFD, no digital twins. Most of its shape was verified with wind tunnels, primitive computers, slide rules, and thousands of hours of hand calculation. The Valkyrie was proof that human beings could reach things they didn't yet have the tools to funchess and experiment, had to be earned. The Air Force ran a naming contest and received 20,000 entries. The winner came from Norse mythology. The Valkyrie, the goddesses who flew over the battlefield and chose who was worthy to live. But its real power lay in something the eye couldn't see. At Mach 3, every aircraft creates a shock wave. It drags the plane back, devours fuel, and tears apart anything not strong enough to endure it. North American looked at the same problem every engineer avoided and did the opposite. They didn't fight the shock wave. They meditate an ally. Past Mach 1.4, the Valkyrie's outer wingtips folded down 65 degrees, trapping the shock wave right beneath the aircraft's belly. It rode the very wave it created, like a surfer, except tearing along at 2 stout miles an hour at the edge of the stratosphere. The technique cut drag dramatically, letting it fly farther without burning more fuel. No bomber had ever done it. That speed came at a price. At Mach 3, air friction heated the skin to nearly 500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to soften aluminum like wax. So its entire skin was stainless steel, brazed into a honeycomb structure no one had ever attempted at that sequas and hatred words over blood, through the whole airframe, absorbing that brutal equity before igniting in the engines, turning the very thing that threatened to destroy it into its cooling system. On April 12, 1966, the second Valkyrie reached Mach 3.08 at 70 perfusing feet. At those outh, the sky above had turned the block violet of space, and the entire North American continent stretched below to the Horus Valkyrie, into the unrest, one thing. Keeping it in 1-2 piece at Mach 3 on closing accept. At that speed, the aircraft doesn't fly to the air, it fights it. Every test which with our most voke on the dark of the corpor of. On May 7th, 1965, the first prototype was tearing along at Mach 2.58 when a dull thud sounded in the cockpit. An instant later, engine warning lights blazed to life. The horizontal splitter at the apex of the delta wing, right between the 2 air intakes, had just been torn from the aircraft. The debris was sucked straight into the intakes. The crew had to shut down 4 engines, numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6. Before landing, they restarted engine 5 to balance the thrust and brought the massive machine down onto the dry lake bed. On inspection, all 6 engines were damaged beyond repair. That wasn't the worst of it. On October 14th, 1965, the Valkyrie first touched the sacred number, Mach 3. But at that speed, heat and stress began to test the honeycomb skin itself. On landing, they found more than half a meter of the left wing's leading edge had vanished, torn away in flight. The first prototype had just proven it could reach Mach 3, but couldn't yet survive there for long. After that flight, a V1 was limited to Mach 2.5. Then there was the unstart, the nightmare of every Valkyrie pilot. A single small disturbance could destabilize the airflow inside an intake, causing thrust to collapse without warning and sending the half-million-pound aircraft shuddering off its heading. Above Mach 2.7, the cockpit could turn into an earthquake in the stratosphere. And amid all that cutting-edge technology, there was one time a $750 million aircraft nearly couldn't lower its landing gear. Pilot Joe Cotton had to take a paperclip and bridge an electrical circuit to save the whole machine. A 39-cent paperclip saved the most expensive thing in the sky. Bit by bit, the engineers tamed the beast. The second prototype flew far more stably. On May 19, 1966, it held Mach 3 for 32 minutes straight, a record for an aircraft its size that has never been broken. After nearly a decade of struggle, the Valkyrie had finally become what it was promised to be. 20 days later, it was all over in under a minute. On the morning of June 8, 1966, 5 aircraft formed over California. This was no military mission, no test flight. General Electric, maker of the engines in all 5, wanted a nice photograph to show its shareholders. They gathered the aircraft that used their engines and placed the Valkyrie at the center. Flying tight off the Valkyrie's right wing was the F-104 of Joe Walker, one of NASA's top test pilots. The formation was too close, and at the tip of the Valkyrie's enormous wing lived something invisible that the aircraft itself had just taught the engineers to fear. A vortex powerful enough to swallow a fighter whole. The F-104 drifted too near. In an instant, it was pulled into the vortex, flipped over, rolled across the top of the Valkyrie, and sheared off both vertical tails before exploding into a fireball. Walker died instantly. The most haunting part was inside the Valkyrie's cockpit. Pilots Al White and Carl Cross sat nearly 200 feet forward of the impact. They heard the shout over the radio, "Mid-air, mid-air." White turned to Cross and asked a question no one would ever forget. He asked who had just been hit. Neither of them knew that their own aircraft had just lost both of its tails. For 16 seconds, the Valkyrie flew straight and calm, as if nothing had happened. Then it began to spin. White triggered his escape capsule, but the 2 clamshell doors closed on his arm. After a few seconds of struggle, he still managed to eject. Carl Cross never got out. He stayed in the cockpit as the best prototype of the entire program plunged into the Mojave Desert. 2 men and one of the only 2 Valkyries on Earth were gone in 16 seconds. The reason they were up there at all was simply to take an advertising photo. The truth is, the Valkyrie's fate had already been sealed. As early as 1961, when surface-to-air missiles reached its altitude and ballistic missiles became cheaper, the Kennedy administration canceled the plan to put it into service. It wasn't beaten on the battlefield. It was left behind by a world changing too fast. But even after its own country turned away from it, the Valkyrie left its mark in the last place anyone would expect, inside the fear of its enemy. In 1959, when the Valkyrie hadn't yet flown a single time, Soviet engineers had already begun building something to counter it. They had never seen it fly. All they had were a few scraps of intelligence about an American machine so fast that nothing in their arsenal could reach it. That was enough. They poured resources into a new interceptor, designed to counter an emerging generation of American targets, and the XB-70 was the most feared of them all. What emerged was the MiG-25. More than 1,000 were built from a program that threats like the XB-70 had helped drive. That was the true weight of the Valkyrie. It never dropped a single bomb, yet it forced an enemy to rebuild part of its air defenses.
And the story closes in an unexpected place. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, the last Valkyrie stands intact in the gallery. Not far away sits a MiG-25, dragged out of the rubble in Iraq in 2003. The hunter and the hunted, finally standing under one roof. The 1966 crash left another mark. The vortex that swallowed the F-104 that day became one of aviation's most famous warnings about the power of wingtip turbulence, helping turn wake turbulence from a little-noticed phenomenon into a hazard every pilot must respect. The XB-70 Valkyrie never dropped a bomb, never flew into battle. The B-52 it was meant to replace is still flying today, while the machine born to replace it exists as a single aircraft in a museum. But the question that created the Valkyrie never went away. 60 years later, the B-21 Raider was born from that same question. How do you get a bomber through a layer of defense that seems impossible to penetrate? The Valkyrie answered with speed. The Raider answers with stealth. It didn't lose because it was inferior. It was simply left behind by a world that changed even faster than it could.